All right, okay, so I think we're just going to jump into it then. Hello and welcome to our Peel Halton Local Employment Planning Council's Labour Market Information webinar. This webinar is the third in our educational outreach sessions and will be focusing on the results of our 2016 employer survey. My name is Andrea Lenfesti and I'm the Communications Specialist for the Peel Halton Workforce Development Group. Just a few housekeeping notes before we go into the content of the webinar. We really want to hear from you today, so please feel free to ask any questions as we go along. There's a question and answer panel on the right side of your GoToWebinar player to share at any time during the webinar. We'll be answering the questions at the conclusion, and I'll be monitoring the space as we go along. Also, please ensure that your screen is maximized, and you may want to minimize or hide the GoToWebinar control panel in order to see the full screen. There's a little arrow button to the left of the control panel at the top. Okay, at this point, I want to introduce you to our featured speakers so we can get right into our content. Our first speaker is Ella Shadpour. Ella is a researcher and analyst with the Peel Halton Local Employment Planning Council, or LEPCI. Ella completed her master's degree in business economics at Wilfrid Laurier University. Previously, she was working at Ryerson University as a research associate. She has 4 years of experience in economic research, market research, data analysis, and modeling. Next, we have our resident labor market analyst and expert, Tom Zizas. Tom has worked for over 2 decades as a consultant in the public, not-for-profit, and international development fields. For the last 15 years, he has specialized in employment programs and labor market analysis, particularly for economically marginalized communities. He is an Innovation Fellow of the Metcalf Foundation, where his research focus has been the changing labor market and the working poor. He has taught public policy, program evaluation, international development, and community economic development courses at York and Ryerson Universities. Tom works regularly with numerous workforce planning boards across Ontario, including the Peel Halton Workforce Development Group. Welcome. Ella, over to you.
Thank you, Andrea, for the introduction. So, hello, everyone. It's a pleasure for us to present the 2016 employer survey results. 2016 was the 6th consecutive year that we conducted the employer survey in Peel and Halton regions. After we cleaned up the survey data, the total number of responses was 738, and the average response per question was 637, which was 32% higher than the average response rate in the 2015 survey. Geographic representation. In this table, the first column illustrates the distribution of respondents in Peel and Halton municipalities, and the second column shows the share of jobs available at those municipalities. The comparison between these two columns indicates that the share of responses in each municipality is proportionate to the share of jobs. For example, in some areas like Milton or Halton Hills, these two percentages are almost equal, and in some areas like Brampton, there is only 3% differences. This slide illustrates the representation of firms by the number of employees. What we have here in this table are the actual number of firms by the company size in Peel and Halton regions, percentage of firms, number of survey respondents, percentage of survey respondents, and the ratio of survey number to the actual number, which is presented in the last row of the table. 62.5% of the firms in Peel and Halton have 1 to 4 employees, 17% have 5 to 19 employees, 10.2% have 20 to 99 employees, and only 2.3% have 100 employees or more. So if you compare this percentage with the percentage of survey respondents in each category, we see that we have overrepresentation of large firms with over 100 employees and underrepresentation of small firms with 1 to 4 employees. For example, look at the first column that shows the companies with 1 to 4 employees. The actual percentage of firms in Peel and Halton is 62.5%. Whereas the survey respondents in that group, their share is 19.7%. So the ratio of the survey respondents to the actual number is 0.3%. And if you compare it to this percentage for the last column, which shows the large companies, which is 10.2%, you'll see it's a big difference here. This issue may slightly skew the results since the challenges and business attitude of small and large firms are different from each other. Okay, industry representation. The table here shows the representation of firms by industry. The first column shows the number of survey respondents per industry. Second column shows the percentage of respondents per industry, and the last column shows the actual percentage share of each industry in Peel and Halton. As seen in some industries such as manufacturing, transportation and warehousing, and educational services, the share of survey respondents is not proportionate with the actual share of firms at those industries. For instance, the share of manufacturing firms among survey respondents was 18.4%, which was very much higher than the actual share, which is 5.4%. And it is quite opposite when it comes to professional, scientific, and technical services industry. In this figure, we categorize the respondents according to a series of qualitative criteria. As seen, almost half of the local businesses expect to grow over the next 2 years. This percentage increases up to 73% when it comes to the firms operating in professional, scientific, and technical services industry. In 36% of the businesses, the main reason for hiring is related to replacing workers, and in 24% of the firms, especially those operating in transportation and warehousing and services, the main focus is to keep the staffing costs down. Next column shows the 11%, which is related to rely on public funding. Actually, surprisingly, only 11% of the firms reported their establishments rely on public funding, whereas 24% of the respondents were from establishments dependent on public funding, such as healthcare, educational services, and public administration. Okay, after we characterized firm by geography, industry, and size, we asked employers if they provide any workplace relevant experience to a student or potential workers, such as co-op, internship, or apprenticeship. The analysis of the survey results clearly shows that providing such experience is highly correlated with the size of the company. Larger companies have higher chance of offering workplace experience due to the availability of more resources. It's 88% in large companies, 100 plus employees, and it's only 61% in companies with 1 to 4 employees. Here, this graph shows the results for the same question by industry category. As seen, providing workplace experience does not vary much among industries. The first column in the figure shows the percentage of all firms that offer workplace experience. The next columns show the percentage of firms who provide such experience in manufacturing, transportation and warehousing, professional, scientific and technical services, and services. Actually, I should mention here that the last column, which shows services, is this column is comprised of retail trade, food services, arts, entertainment, and recreation. This slide illustrates how providing workplace experience can be related to the characteristic of a company. The graph shows 71% of all businesses provide such experience. In companies that are expecting growth in the next 2 years, 69% provide workplace experience. Similarly, 70% of the companies which focus on keeping the staffing costs down, and the ones that mostly hire for replacing employees offer workplace experience. The only big difference here is related to the public funded companies, which is presented in the last column. The percentage increases to 92%. It is important to mention here that most of the workplace experience in public funded companies are more volunteer or unpaid position. We will see this shortly in the next slides. In a follow-up question, employers were asked what kind of workplace experience they provide. The table here illustrates the percentage of employers who provide workplace experience out of all employers who responded to our survey. Whichever they said no, they don't provide any workplace experience, or they said yes, they're providing any one kind of workplace experience. As seen overall, college and university students obtain more workplace experience of any kind compared to other groups. However, high school student and adult student, they get more, mostly hired in unpaid co-op positions. This figure shows the percentage of employers who provide college co-op experience out of all employers who provide any kind of workplace experience. So the focus here in this graph is just providing college co-op experience. As seen in the second and the third columns, the proportion of paid co-op to unpaid co-op is highly correlated with the company size. The larger the company is, the more paid position they offer. In the next three columns, we'll see the industry categories. They're showing the percentage of co-op experience for college students by the industry category. In manufacturing and professional scientific and technical services, the number of paid co-op positions is higher than in services. The last two columns show the college co-op experience by firm's characteristic. As seen, the proportion of unpaid co-op in companies rely on public funding is higher than companies who focus on keeping the staffing costs down. Among employers who did not provide workplace experience, the most common reason for not offering such experience was lack of capacity to host those activities. This issue was cited by 53% of the employers. The percentage for all other reasons were very close, and there were less than 20%, except for one category, which is 4%, and it's related to employers who believe that this experience won't help participants. The other options for this question, which are presented in the columns here, was issues related to the health and safety and insurance liability, believing that these experiences are not helpful to the organization or they're not helpful to the participants, and the lack of learning opportunity in the company. Okay, this figure focuses only on those employers who believe their company does not have the capacity to provide workplace experience. The companies are categorized based on the size of establishments. As seen, the capacity issue is highly dependent on the company size. Around 60% of the companies with 1 to 4 employees and 5 to 19 employees mentioned that they have limitations in capacity, whereas only 45% of the companies with over 20 employees expressed the lack of capacity as the reason for not providing workplace experience. This slide indicates how employers rate a job candidate during interview process. Employers were provided by a range of options such as level of educational attainments, previous related or unrelated work experience, and candidates' performance in the interview. The graph shows that the majority of employers put the highest rank on fit with the company and familiarity with business outcome, followed by performance in the interview and previous relevant work experience. And as you can see here, it seems that volunteer experience and foreign work experience were among the least important options for employers. We also questioned the companies about the major reason for hiring over the next 12 months. The graph here presents the results by skill level: entry level, medium level, intermediate level, and senior level. As seen, the most cited reason for hiring in all skill levels was business expansion. However, the next reasons for hiring vary across different skill levels. For example, in entry-level jobs, seasonal or cyclical and voluntary termination are the next common reasons for hiring over the next 12 months. Among intermediate workers, voluntary termination is the second reason, and maternity leave and involuntary termination together are the third reason for hiring. And in senior level roles, retirement and voluntary termination are expressed as the next reasons for hiring over the next 12 months. To summarize, I would like to draw your attention to a few details regarding hiring. Apparently, in small firms, majority of the hiring is due to the expansion of the business. Manufacturing firms are currently dealing with the aged workforce and more hire for replacing a retired employee. Whereas in professional, scientific, and technical services industry, employers hire both inter-level and senior staff due to the business expansion. And finally, services more hire intermediate and the senior staff for seasonal roles. Thank you so much for your attention, and now I pass it over to Tom.
Good morning. I'm going to be talking about the next series of questions, the first of which was we asked employers about their reliance on temp agencies. And I see that of all companies, temp agencies, but that was highly correlated in terms of size, so that companies with 100 or more employees, half of them, 51%, relied on temp agencies, whereas those with 1 to 4 employees, only 10%. And you can see there's quite a clear trend line. The larger the firm, the more likely they were to rely on temp agencies. In the next slide, we showed the percentages according to industry. So again, in the first column, you can see that same 30% of all companies relied on temp agencies, but there was, again, quite a substantial variation depending on the industry as well as the characteristics of the company. So manufacturing and transportation and warehousing both had over 50% reliance on temp agencies, while professional, scientific, and technical services and the services category, which again includes retail, trade, accommodation and food services, and arts, entertainment, and recreation, had quite a lower reliance on temp agencies. And finally, firms or establishments that relied on public funding had a smaller, made a smaller use of temp agencies. In the next slide, we looked at we asked the reasons for why companies may rely on temp agencies. And we calculated the responses to create a composite score where they either agreed or disagreed or strongly agreed or strongly disagreed with the statement. So you could see that the going from top to bottom are the reasons they were more likely to rely on temp agencies. So flexibility for the short term, time-limited hire, and flexibility for the business cycle were the main reasons that companies gave for relying on temp agencies. To a lesser extent, testing for a future hire, and then items that they were disagreeing on were that they were not trying to avoid the additional costs of employment costs, such as paying for benefits or vacation time, that they were saying it wasn't for a reason of saving money or for avoiding a permanent hire. Obviously, we didn't test for the accuracy of those statements. My own impression is that they're probably choosing those that make more business sense in terms of choosing characteristics or reasons like flexibility. But I think in the next survey we'd want to probe a bit further on some of these issues. Just in the next slide gives us a bit more detail on some of those characteristics. One, that establishments that rely on public funding, overall, they tended to not have very strong support for any of the reasons. It's almost as if they were lukewarm on using temp agencies, and so that they did not show a strong positive indications for any of the reasons we provided. Manufacturing were far more likely than any other category to say that they used temp agencies to test for a potential future hire. The LEPKI currently is doing a project on manufacturing, and I've had occasion to interview around 25 to 30 manufacturers, and I can confirm that in the interviews it's very clear that when you probe them on temp agencies that there are many arrangements with temp agencies that they can test out a potential hire for the future. Small firms, meanwhile, gave many more reasons for relying on temp agencies, including for saving costs and for avoiding additional HR costs like benefits and vacation time and overtime and so on, avoiding a full-time hire and an opportunity to test a future candidate. The next series of questions were the same as the temp agency questions, but here we were asking about contract workers. Now, let me explain this graph because it looks a bit complicated at first. We asked about a whole series of different types of contract workers. So we asked about gig workers, about short-term contractors, long-term contractors, and consultants. But I'm going to ask you, first of all, to read this graph by looking at the black line. So that is the answer where they said, no, we don't rely on any contract worker. Now this graph shows the responses according to the size of firm. So you can see that this black line is pretty well steady for the first three categories. So essentially, 50% of firms that have 1 to 4, 5 to 19, 20 to 99 employees, all of them, around 50% of them, say we don't rely on any contract workers. And then that black line drops sharply when you get to firms with 100 or more employees. So there's 25% who say we don't rely on contract workers. So that's the real message of this slide, that for everyone else, around 50% of them use some type of contract worker, and large firms, essentially 75% rely on contract workers. And then you can see the type of contract worker they rely upon. The dark blue line are short-term contractors, so that's somewhat higher and really shoots up for the 100 plus employees. Then you have the long-term contractors and consultants, and gig workers are there at around around 12 to 15, maybe 18% of reliance on that category of contract worker. In the next slide, we have the same result by industry, and you can see that again, let's look at the black line, because that's the one that shows the degree to which they may rely on contractor workers generally. So publicly funded companies or establishments, 60% of them said they don't rely on contract workers, and then drops off to all the way down to professional, scientific, and technical services, where there's only almost just around 33% say we don't rely on contract workers. So professional, scientific, and technical services have the greatest reliance on contract workers. And in that case, a great reliance on consultants. You can see the proportion, the dark blue line, the proportion shoots up for professional, scientific, technical, which may not be surprising because those are consulting firms, they're law firms, they're accounting firms, they're engineering firms, so may make more use of consultants. Also slightly higher use of gig workers in that category. Okay, the next slide. We asked, as we did with temp agencies, why you might rely on contract workers. And we put up the results here that we got for the temp agency question just to make the comparison. The red bars are contract workers, the blue bars are the reasons respondents gave us for relying on temp agencies. And you can see the proportions are pretty much the same, right? Especially for the issues of flexibility, time-limited hire, flexibility for short-term or for the business cycle. Less so for testing for a future hire. That's not necessarily a reason that you might use a temp agency more often than you would use a contract worker for that purpose. We added one question only for the contract worker. We wanted to know how often you might use a contract worker who was a prior employee. And here the cumulative result here was that there was a slightly a small number who were essentially saying, no, we don't use it for that purpose. I think our own anecdotal evidence would suggest that, in fact, that is the case, particularly for publicly funded companies, governments, and for professional, scientific, and technical services. But here, the survey results says that was less likely to be the case. Okay. Next question has to do with assessment of job candidates. So now these are for all respondents, and we gave them a series of statements, and we asked them to choose the statement that they most agreed with. And the statements were as follows: that job candidates lack hard and soft skills, that job candidates particularly lack hard skills, particularly lack soft skills, have adequate hard and soft skills, or finally, skill shortages only exist in a few occupations. Essentially here, you can see that employers have a relatively low assessment of the skills of job candidates. Only 15% said that job candidates have adequate hard and soft skills. That's a very low percentage. Now, it's also the case that last row that the skill shortages exist in only a few occupations. In essence, those employers are saying this view that there exists widespread skill shortages is not necessarily the case. It's only a comment that applies in the case of certain types of jobs, certain types of occupations. But that being said, almost a third of employers, 31%, said that job candidates lacked hard and soft skills. And if they had to choose, they are especially saying that they lack soft skills. So a large portion, if you totaled up the top line, lack hard and soft skills, and particularly lack soft skills, you've got around 56% saying that job candidates lack soft skills, and around 38% who say that job candidates lack hard skills when you total up the first and second row. Okay. The next slide gives some results by company categories. So a couple of things. So we've only highlighted here manufacturing, professional, scientific, and technical services, and those establishments that are publicly funded. So the publicly funded ones are the green bars. And here I'll say that by and large, publicly funded companies have a more positive impression of job candidates. For example, they are much more likely to say that job candidates have adequate hard and soft skills. You can see the fourth row there. The green bar is much greater than what is the case for the other two categories. And in terms of lacking skills, they always come out lower. On the other hand, professional and scientific and technical services, they put a lot of emphasis on soft skills, right? Manufacturing, of course, don't put that much emphasis on soft skills. They put somewhat more emphasis on hard skills, and generally say that they lack both hard and soft skills. Okay, so so different emphases depending on which industry they're in. So next slide, we wanted to probe a bit further on the type of soft skills that employers feel are lacking. So we gave them a whole list of options that are placed there, and we just asked them to what extent they agreed that those were lacking. There's a bit of a signage here that I used to describe the responses. In some cases, regardless of how you broke up the data, whether it was by size of company or by what industry they're in, there was always roughly the same percentage providing the same answer, okay, giving the same assessment. So and by that I meant that there was a high clustering of responses. Okay, so they all clustered at around the same figure. So for example, you can see third row down, it says oral communication skills. I put a double plus sign there. That means that regardless of how you cut the data, everyone always ranked that much the same way, in this case relatively high. Or if you go right to the bottom, numeracy received a relatively low, a very low score, and there was general agreement, no matter how you cut the data, whether it was by size of company or by industry, that they all agreed that numeracy was not a soft skill that they were seeing that was lacking in any great degree. On the other hand, sometimes you'd have a great variation that some companies were not placing that much importance on a particular soft skill, and some were placing a high importance. And so there, I call that a low clustering of responses, and I'd use a double negative sign. Around fifth from the bottom, customer service oriented is probably the best example of this. Firms in the service sector are clearly going to place a lot of emphasis on customer service, whereas firms in manufacturing are not. So their responses are going to range quite a lot, so that the average response doesn't always reflect the different categories in the same way. So that being said, so that describes those extra symbols of plus, plus, and minus, minus. But you can see that the top 5, say, soft skills are for employers that they say are lacking among their employees are taking the initiative and self-motivation, written communication skills, oral communication skills, problem solving, and critical thinking. and the three lowest ones, just to highlight them for you again: numeracy, teamwork, and comprehension. Okay, the next slide goes into that in a bit more detail, some of which I've already covered, but as I said, services are more likely to cite customer service, but also soft skills like taking the initiative and self-motivation, time management, independent work habits. You can read these yourselves. I'm just going to also mention that professional, scientific, and technical services are most likely to name written communication skills, whereas services are least likely to comment on that. Okay. We also asked about hard skills. We wanted to get into details about hard skills. Now, for this slide, the hard skills can cover such a range, so we actually asked them to write in what hard skill they thought was lacking. So this is an open-ended question, and we actually gave them 4 text boxes so they could list as many as 4 hard skills. So we had 229 employers who provided an entry just in the first box, and then you can see the numbers. In total, we got 545 entries. Right, so they're all listing all these hard skills. Now here's the interesting thing, and I got to tell you, it was not fun trying to do the analysis of this because they're all over the map. But once you kind of went through all of them, 20% of them were actually soft skills. So when employers are saying it's one thing already where they say we think job candidates are lacking soft skills, and we also think they're lacking hard skills. And when we ask them to name hard skills, they actually end up mentioning quite a few soft skills. So they would talk about things like attention to detail and common sense and work ethic. Once you narrowed it down to real hard skills, the one that was most frequently mentioned was something to do with computers. Something about whether it was computer literacy or things, the whole range of I guess very, very high level like knowing about particular programs they would mention, or actually just being able to navigate with a computer, to including things like coding and so on. And then otherwise, the hard skills were either very generic, like they would say things like mechanical ability or being able to work with tools, or sometimes they would be very clear about things like welding or knowing how to conduct sales or having specific trade skills. Okay. Now, all those things. So we've been talking here about employers assessing soft skills and hard skills, and they're providing a relatively negative assessment of job candidates. And I thought, I think it's always important. I mean, this is a survey that we asked of employers. I think it's important to balance their views with what we also hear from employees. Now, this is so I thought I'd put this in there just to give a certain perspective. This is a Gallup poll, or at least a Gallup report that came out just a couple of weeks ago. And this is only tracking U.S. employees, but it was 2 years of tracking at 195,000 employees. Now, some of these findings are pretty striking. 22% of employees strongly agree that the leadership of their organization has a clear direction. That's only 22%. 15% of employees strongly agree that the leadership of their company makes them enthusiastic about the future. 13% strongly agree that their leaders communicate effectively. 12% strongly agree that their organization does a great job of onboarding. So just to put some of the assessments that employers have of job candidates in perspective, the flip side is that employees don't always necessarily think that their bosses, whether they're supervisors or managers or the leadership of their organizations, do a particularly good job at managing either. Okay, next slide. We asked them about how best to address these challenges? Because throughout this survey, we've been asking them issues about making assessments of job candidates, talking about what skills might be lacking and so on. So again, we gave them, I think there are around 12 different themes here, and we asked them to indicate their level of agreement with each of these. And so these, again, are composite scores showing the relative agreement with each of these statements. So you can see at the top, the ones that attracted the strongest agreement were things like teach more soft skills in school, more workplace learning through schools, teach more hard skills in schools. Okay, there's a pattern here. You go to the bottom, and we offered them options like, well, perhaps employers should be targeting more diverse populations, or they should be broadening their recruitment effort, or integrating newcomers better, and those tended to get a lower score. These themes actually, we were able to cluster them. And the next slide will help you see the commonality of some of these themes. So here the box on the left shows kind of the 4 categories of clusters that these questions or these statements represented. One was that we're looking for a response from the education system to solve this. The second category were statements where employers were part of the solution. The third cluster were employers needed to receive assistance in order to address the challenge or the recruitment challenge. And fourthly, employers had to provide the solution themselves in essence. And this was when you weighted all the responses, this is the kind of order in which employers chose these different statements, that essentially employers were looking to the education system to solve it. And secondly, they agreed that there, in various ways, they could be part of the solution. For example, by engaging more with the education system to advise them about what skills are needed, or to cooperate more in terms of providing workplace learning opportunities. Okay. All right. The next slide is we asked employers about specific skill shortages, that which occupations were they experiencing a skill shortage. Again, this had to be an open-ended question. We had over 500 employers respond, and they gave us almost 1,000 entries. But what's striking is that regardless of, even once you start eliminating certain obvious duplications, the number of responses does not create a huge cluster in any given area. Again, like if we had around 1,000 entries, still the single largest category had a range of different occupations in the computer sector, but it only amounted to 55, whether it had something to do with computers or with IT or software or developers or web developers. And then you can see the other clusters, sales of one sort or another, around, again, almost 50. Skilled trades, that did get quite a large response. So 31 who simply said, skilled trades, and then individual trades were mentioned separately. So that's quite a lot. Welders at 16, electricians, and so on. Customer service, then childcare workers, administrative office support, and general labor. But again, many of these occupations often had only 1, 2, or 3 mentions from these 500 employers. So the range of occupations that employers think where there's a skill shortage, there's a large number of occupations, but there's no clustering around any specific occupation. Okay, next is we were asking about, we wanted to ask questions on diversity and inclusion practices. And so we wanted to, prior to getting to that, we wanted to ask whether these companies were federally regulated or not, because federally regulated companies have some obligations under federal legislation to have regard for several categories of employees. So the first question was asking if they were federally regulated or not. 18% said they are, 60% said no, and 22% said they don't know. In actual fact, I think the number of federally regulated companies is under 10%. So there's number one, there's an issue about whether companies recognize or know whether they are federally regulated. Okay, next questions focus specifically on their diversity and inclusion practices. So in this chart, we asked them to rate their performance according in terms of a number of different activities. So whether it came to recruitment or retention, onboarding, formal policies relating to diversity and inclusion, accountability for diversity and inclusion. I'm not going to read through all of them, but you can see the list. And then we asked them for each of them whether they thought their establishment's performance was excellent, satisfactory, needs improvement, or needs serious improvement. So by and large, if you add up their excellent and satisfactory scores, most companies, most respondents felt that their company on all these different measures, at least 70% or more felt that their company had a satisfactory or excellent performance in regard to these areas. Now I have to say, I think that they're probably rating their assessment is probably a bit high, and the way I want to illustrate this is in the next slide. We singled out companies that have only 1 to 4 employees. On the next slide, we have the technology we're using here is a voice activated slide changer. And so I sometimes have to make sure the technology is working. So here, these are companies that are 1 to 4 employees, and these companies are giving themselves really high scores. Like they're often 75 or 80% saying they're having an excellent or satisfactory measurements.
Tom, are you still there?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I think you dropped out for a second.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
That's okay.
So when you're, so the reason why I have some questions about the responses that employers gave here is that when you get to areas like at the last 2 rows, tracking the progress of diversity and inclusion performance and tracking diversity and inclusion performance and linking it to the performance of the company, that's actually a very sophisticated level of diversity and inclusion practices. So for example, this is something where the banks are very much involved in this, but it's something they actually are still in the process of implementing, particularly linking diversity and inclusion practices to company performance. So when you have companies that are have 1 to 4 employees and saying that they're 85% of them are satisfied with their ability to track this, I think that gives us reason to question whether these results actually reflect what's happening on the ground. Okay, the next question we asked them when it came to diversity and inclusion, whether they targeted a particular group. Okay, and so overall, 74% said no. We don't target any one group, and then you can see in terms of the rest, the options they chose, the weights they gave to different companies targeting certain groups. There were differences. Distinct differences in terms of different categories. So for example, overall, around 7% of firms targeted women, but professional and scientific and technical services, almost 20% said they targeted women. Youth were targeted by around 6%, But services, again, perhaps because they're more likely to rely on youth, whether they're food services or retail trade, 11% of them said they targeted youth. Newcomers to Canada, interestingly, transportation and warehousing, a higher percentage. I know we have a number of bridging programs and placement programs relating to the supply chain sector in Peel and Halton that target newcomers, so that may be one of the reasons why the number's a bit higher. And publicly funded firms were more likely to target racial minorities than what was the average for all the companies. So the last thing we asked them about was we just gave them an opportunity to provide a general comment. And so we received almost 100 comments, but around 40 of them were, we received around 140 comments. 40 of them said, no, thank you, I don't have any comment to make. But of the ones who did comment, again, the cluster or the theme that was most often mentioned was they still wanted to comment about what they felt was the poor quality of job candidates, especially what they called either the unreliability of workers or the high expectations that workers had. We had a bit of pushback on the question around why we were asking questions about diversity. So you would have a couple of comments where people would say, I don't hire on the basis of what group a person comes from. I try and get the best person possible for the job, which so partly probably there's some explanation that some time is needed to make clear why we might focus on diversity and inclusion. Other comments were generally about how do we solve these problems. A number of them again wanted to emphasize that they felt the education system was failing in some way, particularly around the issue of youth and vocational skills relating to blue-collar jobs. And then there were a couple of comments about they felt that specifically about the content or format of the survey itself. So just to summarize, we've got, I guess, a couple of statements that we would call, I suppose, takeaway statements from this analysis of the survey. So these are in the next slide. A couple of items that you can use when you're summarizing it with someone else. 7 out of 10 employers said that they provided some form of workplace relevant learning experience. Those who don't, the main reason is they don't feel they have the capacity. Most important factor when it came to hiring was fit with the company. Around a third of employers felt that job candidates lacked both hard and soft skills, but when it came to singling out one or the other, they're far more likely to mention soft skills. They place a lot of expectations on the education system for solving the problems of the labor market in terms of the skill levels and preparation for employment. And the other thing, I guess, about this survey, we've been trying for the last couple of years to find what are those, how can we distinguish employers apart from simply their size or their industry to try and understand why they have better or poorer HR practices or why they answer a certain way around hiring or what their expectations are of employees. And I can't say that we found it yet. Like, we're still searching. When we do the cross tabulations, the characteristics that we find aren't enough yet to explain why some companies have better HR practices and others have lower HR practices, but that's something I think we're still going to try and work on in the surveys to come. So that's it in terms of the overview of the survey results.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Really appreciate that great analysis. We have actually we have quite a few questions, so I don't think we'll be able to answer all of them today. So I just wanted to throw it out there. If you want your question answered, if you want to email it to me at lenfesty, lenfesty @peelhaltonlepkey.com. I'm in the the GoToWebinar information. So if you want to send that to me, I'd be happy to send it on to our experts and have them respond. But the first question we'll try to answer today is, if 71% of companies are providing workplace experience to students, why are students claiming that they cannot find placements in co-ops, etc.?
I think there might be a couple of reasons for that. First of all, it might be that our survey response may be a bit high for the following reason. Our survey is sent out by partners, and we get one of our almost around 20% of our responses came from employers who had links with Sheridan College. So we may have a slight skew in that response, number one. But secondly, even with that, I think the other thing is that whereas 71% say they provide some form of workplace experience, it may not be the type that particular student's looking for. Like some, they may provide a college co-op placement because they have a relationship with the school, or they may provide an apprenticeship position, but they don't provide a high school co-op position. So if you're a high school student, it doesn't help you. Or the reverse, that's actually quite a high number do provide some form of high school co-op placement, typically unpaid, but then they don't provide any internship for university students. So, so even though 71% provide it, they only may provide one type of it.
Okay, great. I'm just worried that we may get cut off in terms of our timing automatically, so I just want to let everybody know there was quite a few questions about, is this available after the presentation? We've recorded today's webinar, so it'll be available on demand on our website, and we'll be emailing all participants when that link is available. And then there's also an exit survey at the end of the webinar. If I could ask that you kindly fill it out, that would help us greatly in terms of providing content for the next webinars or any sessions that we do with the Peel Halton Workforce Development Group. Thank you, everyone. I think that's all the time we have. And if you're looking for more local, reliable, and timely labor market information, be sure to visit our sister site, www.workinginpeelhalton.com. If you're an employer in Peel or Halton and you're looking to find candidates, please feel free to connect with our Talent Hub at 905-306-9588. On behalf of Tom, Ella, and the entire team at the Peel Halton Local Employment Planning Council, thank you so much for joining us and taking the time to view our presentation. My name again is Andrea Lenfesti, and it was a pleasure spending this last hour with you. Have a fantastic day.